evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are privileged to have a Master of India in our midst, and apologies for the slightly delayed start. To begin this evening's very special program, a book discussion on a very special book which talks about a very pertinent issue in India at present. The book is called Waste of a Nation, Garbage and Growth in India. To moderate this session, we are indeed lucky to have with us Mr. Nagaraj Rao Harshadeep, who's the global lead in charge of watersheds for the World Bank, and also the lead environmental specialist at the bank, leading efforts to promote integrated multi-sectoral approaches in a spatial context. Harsh is a BTech in Civil Engineering from IIT Chennai, a Master's in Environmental and Resource Engineering from Syracuse, and a PhD in Water Resources and Environmental Systems from Harvard University. His very prolific work profile, and it is indeed prolific, includes a lot of work in India on strengthening state pollution control boards, irrigation and water resource departments, the National Hydrology Program, watershed management, and other rural development initiatives. Now I would request Harsh to please come up on stage and introduce the two authors, Assa Doron and Robin Jeffrey. Harsh, the stage is yours. Can I just request everyone to please keep their cell phones off, or at least silent. Thank you.
Thanks. It's great to be here among you all, and it's my pleasure to be able to moderate today. I have been co-opted by some of my old friends from Harvard, and this is a real pleasure because it's a subject very close to my heart. I've been here for about 30 years now in the US, but keep going back very regularly through a lot of the work at the bank. And one of the things that you begin to see is that as a country grows, so does its environmental challenges. So as cities grow, as you have more urbanization, with about 400 plus million people now living in cities and growing every day, you have a lot of externalities that happen as a result too. They are not only the centers of a lot of the economy, but they also end up becoming the centers of a lot of the waste that the society produces. So you have 60 plus million tons of solid waste produced every year. You have a lot of liquid waste which pollute a lot of the rivers. You have a lot of the waste into the atmosphere, which then cause a lot of urban air pollution and other things, plus a whole range of other issues that we have. So how do you deal with all of these? And I think today we have a couple of authors who've done a great job to try and think about how to look at this in a more with all of its connections involved. So it's not just a technical problem, it's also a social problem, it's also a political problem. It's also the way in which you look at waste from different stakeholders' point of view and so on. So we've had two authors here. One is Assa Doron, who I'm sure you could do a better job with your name, but then try my name. And then he's an associate professor who's been working on anthropology and is with the currently with the Australian, he's a Australian Research Council Future Fellow, but he says it's a past Future Fellow now. And he is working at the Australian National University as part of that. And we also have Robin Jeffrey, who is visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore. And he's an emeritus professor of La Trobe University in Melbourne. And his background is more in politics and other kind of associated activities, but mainly history to try and look at this. So that's why we have this really, and he's also at the Australian National University in Canberra. And I think in their book, they have explained a lot from their perspective, looking at the anthropology of waste, looking at the history of waste, and also in some ways at where the future is going, looking at these kind of elements. So instead of me talking about the book, let's hear directly from the authors. So please come up. mic, so please go ahead. And I think it'd be great if what we'll do is hear for about 20 minutes from them about the book itself, and then we'll open it up for questions that you may have for the authors, and we'll be able to discuss that as well.
Well, first, Harsh, thank you for agreeing to moderate this discussion, and thank you, Ambassador, for inviting us here. It's a very nice opportunity to be in this building, which has, I'm sure, all sorts of great ghosts running around inside it. And thank you all for coming, because it's very nice to be able to talk to people who are interested in the topic and are also interested in India. We got interested in this particular aspect. People say, why are you working on garbage? You know, you've written a lot of garbage in a 50-year career, but now you've got your head into it. And it really came about, it's his fault, because we were trying to write a book 5 or 6 years ago about mobile phones. And if you get interested in mobile phones, of course, we all have, how many mobile phones have we all had in our lives? I've had a mobile phone now for more than 20 years, and I guess I've gone through about 5, and I'm fairly moderate. Some people change their mobile phones the way they change their haircuts or buy new pairs of shoes. I'm a bit moderate in these things. But the question was, what happens to Indian mobile phones when they die? And Assa, you should tell what happened when you went to Selampur.
Well, yeah, I guess, again, thank you very much for inviting us, and thank you all for being here. When we finished our mobile phone book, that too with Harvard, we decided, we understood that there is something going on, that there is an afterlife to mobile phones in India. Now, there are different aspects to these afterlives. One is the limiting purchasing power of many people in India who cannot afford to abide by this planned obsolescence or fashion obsolescence, this upgrade culture that we're all very much enmeshed in. And so we looked at the repair people in India, the mistris, people who tweak the mobile phone and repair them and extend their lives. But what happened after that? And when I was working in Gafar Market, Lajpat Rai, and other places in India, I realized that there's a whole economy of the dead mobile phones, and where do they go? In one place is Selampur and other places around Delhi, and also in the provincial places like Moradabad, formerly the brass capital of India. And we visited these places, I visited these places, and I said to Robin, there is something going on here with the electronic waste economy in India, which is burgeoning, and it's really growing. We also discovered that there's a lot of questions that need to be asked about the kind of offshoring of electronic waste from so-called first world countries into India. And so this is what got us started thinking about waste economies and expanding it more broadly, where in the book we discuss also questions of both solid waste from plastic, paper, electronic waste, shipwrecking, to other forms of waste, liquid waste, which is of course sanitation. And these two, we don't make the differentiation as in many books they do, because we believe that there is certain continuities. And we began this project about a year before Swachh Bharat was launched, so we were delighted to see that happen afterwards.
Yes, I think Swachh Bharat has made what we were doing much more topical and much more interesting. One of the ways we've approached the book when we've talked about it with audiences is to look at characteristics of the Indian problem, that is the problem of making a cleaner place. Ways in which we can analyze that problem by looking at the assets that India brings to the problem, and I think some of them are considerable, assets that other countries haven't had, and then looking at the obstacles that stand in the way of the achievement of a Swachh Bharat by October 2019, if we were to take those targets seriously. The assets are ones that, if you've traveled in India or if you are from India, you'll know very well. There are what exists already, to begin with, is the old Kabari culture. Everyone who's lived in India has a Kabari story, unless they're under 25, when the Kabari, I think, has begun to sort of fade away like the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland. You know, vaguely the Cheshire Cat and the Kabari disappear together. But if you've lived in India before that time, the notion of the bicycle coming down your street, particularly I associate it with Sunday afternoons, and you get that kabari coming from down the street, breaking the silence. And then there'd be the lovely interludes when he would arrive, and he was always a he. He'd arrive at the door, and usually the woman of the house would enjoy a bartering session with him about how much the newsprint was worth this week, whether it weighed 3 kilos or 3.5 kilos. And that was, they were wonderful times. But the important thing is that kabari culture still lives. There are still plenty of people, not as old as me, who can remember that and think that it wasn't a bad idea. It was rather good. So there's that kind of culture to build on. Related to that, of course, is the frugality that's always been part of India in the time I've known it, partly inspired by the Gandhian national movement, the idealism that was still there in 1967 when I first went to India, and has continued to exist throughout the last 50 years. The fact that there's enough for every man's, every man's need, but not enough for every man's greed. Those wonderful little aphorisms of Gandhi. That I think is an asset. The fact, too, that India did not have a lot of consumer goods until 20 or 25 years ago. So that made people darn socks, knit sweaters in ways that weren't there before. All of these are assets that can be built on. The obstacles, of course, are formidable. The obstacles relate in some ways to the assets. For example, one of the things that I think Swachh Bharat has going for it is the huge investment of funds that's gone into the campaign. That's clearly a good thing. The other is the high-level political pressure that's come with this. I've gone through the photographic records as much as I think one can online, and the only prime minister I can see photographed wielding a broom is the current Prime Minister. He's photographed regularly, or I don't know about regularly, but he's not been averse to being photographed sweeping, doing a bit of sweeping with a long-handled broom. That pressure, I think, translates all the way down to district officers, that there are targets to be achieved in order to please the Prime Minister, to satisfy the requirements of my service, and, of course, to get promoted, or not to be demoted and sent to a more remote station, or a less desirable one. So this is an asset, but there's a flip side to that asset, and the flip side is that the target driving can lead to terrible excesses. And Assa, you want to say anything about
I think what
how
you
that
said,
works?
well, the obstacles, if you will, as you mentioned, I think relate to the fact that we're dealing with, first of all, the magnitude of waste in India is just enormous now. But it's not only the magnitude of waste in terms of the population density, where India is, of course, perhaps second to Bangladesh, is the most density populated country in the world, but the churning of waste and the nature of waste has changed. So if it was more the kind of gila waste, the kind of wet waste that we're used to now, the types of waste have changed. It's not only the middle class itself. We can always blame the middle class because they're consuming more and more white goods and more TVs and, of course, mobile phones. But it is also the poor who rely on the fast-moving consumer goods, on these sachets that you see in India everywhere, from the shampoo to the laundry powder to the pan masala. So these people who are now relying more on Maggi noodles and so on because they are migrating to cities, to these urban centers, and they don't have a place where they can actually engage with the waste as they did in the past. So you have various sources of this enormous amount and the changing nature, composition of this waste. And of course, the second critical aspect that we try and identify in the book itself is the question of caste. In India, traditionally, there are people who are charged with removing polluting things. Those who are considered ritually polluting, the formerly called untouchables. And unfortunately, we see that this remains still in India. And this is maybe this enduring system of caste is maybe something that binds also the question of sanitation, or liquid waste, and solid waste, where we still have instances in India where people who actually remove the liquid waste are the manual scavengers who belong to these disadvantaged communities, these untouchable castes, alongside with poor Muslims and other migrants. And these are what we identify as perhaps the most critical aspects to try and address when you think about the waste obstacles in India.
Yes, I think there are two elements that, in terms of obstacles, that are unique to India. One is the sheer magnitude. No other country has had to deal with so many people producing so much waste in such a limited area of place to put it. The population density of India is nearly 3 times greater than the population of China, which, although China is a bigger overall population, it's a much bigger space. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Chinese have made the Gobi Desert into one gigantic landfill. It's not that simple, but nevertheless, the degree of crowding is greater in India. Bangladesh is the only country that approaches it in density, or indeed exceeds it in density. That is a country of a substantial size, not the city-states of Singapore and such places. The difference is that Bangladesh, so far, is not actually producing the kind of thrown-away things in the volume that India is. For example, Bangladesh, I don't think, has a steel industry to approach the Indian steel industry. The construction and demolition waste, the pharmaceutical waste produced in Bangladesh doesn't approach what's produced in India. The hazardous waste, the chemicals that go on in the process of Indian industrialization aren't matched in Bangladesh. So India has a problem of magnitude that really is, I think, unique in world history. And the other, of course, is caste. I don't think there's any other country. Japan have the Burakumin, who are low-status people associated with death and tanneries and unpleasant tasks. But the Burakumin are rather different, though not totally different. Apartheid in South Africa had something akin to untouchability in India. But caste is the major one. And I think one of the deficiencies of Swachh Bharat is that until there's a direct attack on caste itself, or rather than an attack, a more positive way of approaching the problem, that is, a way of saying the people who remove your waste should be of all categories and of all kinds, until that begins to happen, that this is not the task of only a select group who are born to it. Until that begins to happen, it's going to be very hard to create the kind of Swachh Bharat that people envisage. And I think that may be one of the deficiencies of the expenditure of the current campaign, that not enough is going into demonstration and education. That kind of propaganda, we were talking earlier, I was talking with a friend about public policy and the idea of nudge economics, which I learned more about in the last half hour than I knew before coming here. I know a little bit about it, but I know more about it now. The idea that you gently shift people's beliefs and values in a particular direction. Now, it sounds like a long-term and rather tortuous process, but in fact, I think the longest way round may be the shortest way home if you really want substantial, sustained achievement.
I think you're absolutely right. One of the key issues that we've also sought to address and identify is the question of the local government. In India, the local government is underpowered and undervalued. The officers themselves don't see themselves invested in their career path in those local governments, and the skills, expertise, and development within those institutions are simply not there. So that's another area which is worthwhile investing in, so people can, like in Australia or in the United States, in the city of Yarra. Robin, you talk about that?
Yeah, I think in many countries, you make a career in local government. And you move. We live in the city of Yarra. The greater Melbourne area in Australia, home of the MCG, if you need to locate it on your mental sporting map. Melbourne Cricket Ground, that is. Melbourne has 32 local governments, 32 municipalities. The one we live in, the chief executive officer began her career in the Reserve Bank of India. Worked for 11 years in the RBI, went to New Zealand and got into local government in New Zealand as an administrator, came across to Australia about 15 years ago and has been our CEO for the past 5 or 6 years. Now, she runs a municipality of about 100,000 people, a staff of about 1,000. She's on about 350,000 a year. That's Australian dollars a year is her salary. She may eventually, I guess, choose to move up to a larger municipal corporation for more money, or she may retire. But it's a good salary, and it is a career. And she sees herself, I think, as a developer of young people in her administration as career officers in local government. And I think that you can find that in India. Of course, you can find everything in India if you go looking, but it's not a common pattern. And I think it's a very important cultural tendency that needs to be encouraged, but at the moment is lacking. Just as Assi was saying, local governments lack a lot of the legal and financial authority to do the jobs that are expected of them. Local governments, in spite of amendments to put them constitutionally in place, are still suffering from what the British imposed on them when they first established them. The idea was to set up a body of government, give it responsibilities, underfund it, and then blame its Indian officers for not achieving the targets they were supposed to. It was a nice way of passing the buck, local government, for the old British Raj, and too much of that, I think, remains.
And I think another really important thing to highlight is that as an anthropologist and a historian, what we try to identify and discuss is actually it's very easy to find in India things that go wrong if you want to. But what we try to identify that actually civil society, the NGOs, the local governments that do work, that are committed to Swachh Bharat, to cleaning India, to questions of sanitations, because there are these instances and they can serve as certain models for others to follow suit. So while it's, again, these questions are mammoth, they can seem daunting, there are very good examples of things that do work.
I think if we have a kind of agreed set of desirable things that need to happen, which would enable a Swachh Bharat to be progressively achieved, or big strides to be made towards a successful Swachh Bharat. One is that the lower status people who currently do a lot of the work in collecting or cleaning up India, and do it imperfectly. I think most would agree. It's not done thoroughly, systematically, but it is done. Those people need to be drawn into a much more systematic pattern, and the return for them needs to be respect and decent wages, decent salaries, decent equipment, and education both for their children, formal education for their children, but education for them in how the job is done, why it's important, and how it can be done better, what the dangers of doing the job are. There needs to be a systematic and scientific and sensitive way of bringing this wonderful labor force which exists into a much more effective method of collection. And that needs to include, as I've said, recognition of the service they provide, so it's dignity, and it needs to include decent payment. The discipline and dignity, I think, are the two qualities that have to be there to make a system work. Where we see cities elsewhere in the world that do seem to achieve that level of cleanliness and that level of cleaning upness, in Northern Europe, perhaps, in the Nordic countries, in the Netherlands, the people who work in the industry are actually paid sufficiently to make it worthwhile and are treated with respect.
I think I give a last example, which I saw when I was visiting different NGOs in India. For instance, when I visited the Women's Union in Pune and in other places, and they were working alongside the local government, and as such they got protective gear, they got holiday pay, they got health insurance, and all the benefits that come with this kind of recognition and incorporation into the system. Now they had already the knowledge of where to collect the waste, how to collect it, and what to recycle, what can be taken out from what eventually ultimately ends up in the landfill, right? Now, what happened when I was there, a contractor came and said to the municipality, he undercut them, of course. He said, I will do it for cheaper, and I will do it by the ton. So when you do it by the ton, you don't siphon off, you don't take out the recyclables. It all goes to the landfill on bulk. And these women that I spoke with told me that they no longer get pay or the trolley or the gloves, and if they miss one day of work, they'll be fired. It's contractual. So I think that's for us distills the example of how you might be able to incorporate these people into a system and harness their abilities, their skills, and give them some sort of dignity in their work.
Thank you both very much for making trash talk interesting. And I think, there's a, when you look at these problems and the seemingly insurmountable problems that we have on the environment in India, there's often it brings to mind a Swahili saying, which is, how do you eat an elephant? Is supposed to be the question. And the answer is supposed to be that you start with the first bite, then it becomes easier. You need some vegetarian version of it also. But the thing with this is, with all of these programs that are ongoing now in terms of Swachh Bharat, smart cities, Ganga rejuvenation, smart villages, a whole range of these new programs that are starting up, all of these are, I think, taking bites out of this huge problem. And I think, as we've heard today, there's a need to try and clean not just the environment, but the mind in some ways, to try and look at some of the social angles on this to look at. So let's hear from all of you. Please keep your questions short and make sure that there's a question somewhere in that process as well. Let's take one at the back, if we can, please.
Hello, writers. I'm also an author. So my question is, I'm Dr. Afshan Hashmi. My question is, what inspired you to write this book?
Let's collect 2 or 3 questions and then we'll have them answered together. So,
thank you very much. I'm Raghuveer Goyal. I'm a journalist in Washington. My question is that I used to live in Chandigarh, known as the most cleanest city in India, coming all this from foreign countries. But in 70 years, only Prime Minister Modi is the one who took this initiative, Clean India, at any cost. So where do we go from here? Because Congress did not take any action in 70 years, but only in the last, when Modi ji came. So where do we go from here? What is the future? What message do you have all? Thank you.
My name is Jay Bhandari, and I'm from Indore. And I think, Indore is declared as the world's cleanest city right now. And in Indore, they have started what you just mentioned to process the waste, and they are separating the liquid waste and the dry waste, and they have plants, and they are making every effort to make it clean and giving employment to many people. They are giving dignity to the people who used to take on their head the waste. So I think many of the big city people recently visited Indore, and Switzerland people also were there, and they are copying it. And I hope that sooner or later, India will be cleanest country.
Yeah. All right. So maybe you guys want to take some of those questions first, and then we'll go around and get more questions next. So please.
What inspired us, I think, is it really was the day he came back from going to Selampur. And what I remember, and he didn't tell you, was that he'd seen little kids working in very dangerous conditions. My memory of the story, and you know what memory's like, you should never trust memory, is that he'd seen one of these little kerosene cookers with a saucepan and 3 or 4 phones in the saucepan melting the plastic so the little fingers could reach in and pull out the expensive metal components of a cell phone because they were valuable. Now, I may have embroidered that story, but that's the story that's inspired me for the last 5 years while we worked on it, that there was so much more here than simply, the garbage being collected by somebody somewhere when you put it out on of a morning or give it to somebody who comes down the back lane. So that was the inspiration, and one thing led to another. So I've become interested in chemistry, in local government, which I never thought I would ever be interested in, all sorts of topics that begin to intersect with this. We met so often guys who were in the business of managing waste, as you say, sir, formal waste management systems that had been established and were working quite well. And the people who were running them would say, now we'll tell you how it works here, but it's a little complicated. And that's been the joy of thinking about this. It is a little complicated. And as an intellectual puzzle, that's absolutely fascinating. And as a social and human problem, it seems to me worth doing to try to understand holistically what is going on, what the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle are that have to be made to fit. That's perhaps doing somebody some good in the long term, but it's also a very stimulating kind of thing to think about. So that would be my response to that. Did we have one?
Yeah, I think it was also that there's now cities in India that are cleaning up.
Indeed, yeah.
Do you have anything to add? Okay. Okay, let's take another round of questions. So, here.
So I agree with you about the local government and setting up the systems. How do you make people do civic duty about putting the trash in the trash cans and those being available?
Okay, let's take a couple of.
Yeah, so I have a two-part question. The first is somewhat related to what you were asking, but it's about what policies are in place to drive, so as consumerism increases, uses of plastics and things like that continue to rise, and what is being done to sort of reduce that, eliminate plastic bags and all of those kinds of things. The other aspect I'm curious about is from a circular economy perspective. What's being done to look at converting some of this waste into valuable products, and is there any movement around those kinds of activities in India?
Yeah, go ahead.
I've been working for some time with local governments. I'm a local government guy in India, as boring as it may seem. And I just want to add to what we said. I think the big difference that I see in India is that there's almost a total lack of ownership or responsibility of the people who are generating the trash. And it's very difficult for many people to throw the trash over the wall. We look at it oftentimes as a management problem, but it's not a management problem as much as it is a systems problem, and that system starts at the sink. It starts at separating the dry waste from the wet waste so that things can be recycled. And to place the entire burden on the municipalities will never work for the same reason it doesn't work here. We will all go home and put things in our recycling bin and put things in the trash, and some of us will compost. And we're much more developed in that kind of thinking, and I don't yet see in India that kind of ownership or participation in the process, and it makes for a very, very difficult problem, almost an impossible problem to solve if, in fact, as in Pune, I'll pay you by the ton, put everything in the truck, take it out, then there's no reason for me to separate at that point.
I might take the last one first because I think it kind of will come back to the other questions. I think it's very easy for us in the so-called West to think that we are the enlightened people who engage in these redemptive acts of recycling. I think that much of our waste ends up in other places. It's offshored. And we don't really want to know what happens to that waste. And the same thing goes in India. I think what a lot of people ask me, so why is it that Indians don't separate, and why don't they care for public spaces and so on and so forth? I think it's not a question about whether it's an inherent thing about a civilization or not. It's also a question who occupies these public spaces. In India, you have gated community, you have increasingly the middle class who are segregating themselves. The public spaces are being taken away from people who occupy and populate them, the vendors and other such people. And also the poor who service the middle class. Why should they be invested in public spaces that don't care for them? Why should they be invested when they're harassed by the police, when they're not allowed to go to places and relieve themselves in dignity? Where should they even put those packets of Maggi noodles or shampoo sachets? They don't have the infrastructure. So it's a combination of things that I think assigning blame or accusing the population has to be coupled with a much more holistic understanding of these issues. Maybe you want to talk about the recycling.
Yes, I mean, the recycling element in this, it can be very impressive. And the recycling of plastics is done at such a cottage industry level in so many places. It's not, the problem is it's not done systematically. It's done in patchworks where plastic is collected, where there are waste pickers who have seen the value, and there are kabaris who know how to convert that plastic into some kind of increased value. Assa has a line that he's fond of, that waste to gain value has to move. Once something, the first movement is when we throw it out. The second is when someone picks it up at that point. And the third is the key one, where it goes from there. And to regain some value, that waste probably has to pass through 4 or 5 different processes before the bottle cap on the beer bottle on Kovalam Beach becomes the base of a tali being manufactured in a factory in, say, Tiruchirappalli, which is, he's followed some of those progresses where the beer bottle caps made of good aluminum end up becoming talis on dinner tables after a number of steps along the way of making them into something else. Now, that wonderful tradition is there, but it's not particularly systematic. How much of India's plastic that's discarded every day is recycled, I think, is doubtful. It looks as if a lot is, but I think if you look at the figures that come from people like the Down to Earth magazine producers, the Center for Science and Environment in Delhi, they will say, look, no, we don't really get we don't get a huge percentage of our thrown away plastic and things, but what we do get, we do make into something else because there are people who have an interest in doing that. So the recycling is going on, but it's that system, that relentlessness and that thoroughness that is lacking.
And I think if I can add a note on the issue of the civic responsibility angle, some of the cleanest, it doesn't have to do with how rich you are. For example, one of the cleanest cities I've been to is Kigali, for example, in Rwanda. Because they take great pride in going out every other weekend and cleaning up the city and things like that. There are many other challenges, but at least the thing is the civic angle can make a big difference to the cleanliness of a particular city. And that's something to look at. But also the plastics thing at the bank, for example, is becoming a really big thing because there's about something like 300 million tons of plastic produced every year. India produces about 5.5 million out of that. But places like Indonesia, you go to places like Bali and so on, a lot of the beaches make the really polluted Indian beaches look good in comparison, right? If you look at these things. But it also is an indication of things to come. And this is where there's a lot of challenges now that everybody is waking up around the world and trying to see how to protect a situation where you have a lot of the plastics ending up in the oceans and becoming microplastics and ending up in the food chain and bioaccumulating with other PCBs and other things in the system. So these are things which become real health hazards after some time as well. And that's the whole, I think, looking at it at a systems perspective, as someone was saying, becomes the key. So can we hear some more questions, please?
My name is Vinod Goyal. I grew up in India in an industrial town. When we talk of garbage, there could be 2 types. One is the domestic, the other is industrial. India has done a tremendous job in recycling. I still remember when I was growing up, all the sugar plants, they were creating so much after crushing the sugar, so that was called bagasse. We imported the technique from Brazil. And now what we are doing is every sugar plant has also processed the paper. And entirely it goes into the paper mill because they found it is much better. They can also create out of that rum. Then I was also in Tatanagar where the slag, and the slag is so big, mountains and mountains. So one engineer came and he saw the steel mill in England. We imported the technology there. So what we use that slag. The slag is used for road building. So what other people have said it is correct. In order to advise the general public, that culture is not there. And it has been coming from time. So you have to separate. India is an ideal place to visit and see how we recycle. Now coming back to this domestic waste, because bins are being created and they are, but still people think it. In Calcutta, I was still remembering, I used to carry an umbrella all the time. I asked my father, how come this umbrella? It's not raining, it's not even what you call sunshine. So, but he said, look, and somebody will just clean their place and just throw it right on the street. And I saw with my own eyes. So I'm not trying to decry about that, but when you talk of India, what we are talking is, we are fourth in population, fourth times in India, and we create in United States much more garbage. But because of the government so powerful in India, I talked to Mr. Modi and I said, just 1 rupee, you put it outside, 1.2 billion rupee, if you collect it, that garbage can be gone.
Thank you, sir. So, can we hear, ma'am, your question?
I was actually before.
Oh, sorry. Go,
I was
please.
waiting for
Okay.
the mic.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
My name is Mithun Banerjee, and thanks the Indian Embassy for hosting this. I'm wearing 2 hats today. I have 2 points to make. On behalf of IIT Alumnus Group, Will's Global Foundation, I was talking to Suresh. He was not able to make it, so he told me to ask this. As already we know that India's garbage content is highly made up of organic waste with low calorific value, and I'm not aware of the recycle over there and how technologically Will Global Foundation can able to work on that. That's number 1. And number 2, I'm also associated with Worldwide Archem Alumni. I'm the chairman of that, where we had the inauguration last year with President of India. So there are a couple of cities in India already zero garbage, no garbage at all. And with the help of Swachh Bharat initiative of central government, so Ambikapur, Chhattisgarh, Udupi, Kojangar, Assam, and there are Jambu, Tamil Nadu, there is a Coimbatore, Amritsar, Punjab, Raebareli, UP, Kota, so on and so forth. There is something called SLRM, Solid and Liquid Resource Management, which was, I think you were aware of that, work of Srinivasan.
With liquid sludge, yeah.
Yes. So I would like to ask you if you can comment on those 2 points.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Natasha. I'm a public policy student. I think what I was interested in knowing is whether there's a caste story in solid waste as well. I'm aware of the caste story that's there in liquid waste, but if you could, highlight a little bit about that. Yeah, thanks.
I promise this is a very short question. Looking forward to reading the book, and I obviously don't want to give up the suspense, but are there any simple solutions to this massively complex problem? So, and if they are in the book, okay, I can wait to buy it and read it, but if you can comment on those, that'd be great.
The first bite of the elephant. Look at this. Okay, so let's take these. And by the way, there's also a really good review that's out in Nature magazine as well for the book, which also does a pretty good job of summarizing the mountain of waste that India has to deal with.
Simple answer, no, I think, as so many, as I said a few minutes ago, so many of the really clued up, knowledgeable people we met who had got their hands dirty trying to make their systems or their cities better, they would begin a conversation by saying, it's a little complicated, and it is a little complicated, not insoluble, but certainly complicated. On there being garbage-free cities in India, that's wonderful. I wish them well. I hope they have a lovely time.
I really want to visit them.
And I look forward to visiting them. I really don't know. I couldn't comment on the cities you mentioned. And whether I haven't been in India now for 18 months, so I couldn't comment on how clean they are now, but I guess I'd be a little bit skeptical in a good Scots way about adhema doots, as the Scots would say. And the caste question, well, of course, the people who collect waste are invariably Dalits, low-status Muslims, or people who have come from the villages, usually low-status people from the villages who have nothing else to fall back on. And that's one of the things that the old system of random waste picking had a sort of benefit, because it was where you could begin life in the city. It was perhaps the lowest and nastiest way, but it was a way of picking out a living for a day or two. If you become too systematic in your waste collection, that option is removed, because the people collecting the waste, it's their job to do it, and they'll do it thoroughly. And there's a downside for somebody in all of this. In all the so-called solutions, there are going to be losers in certain circumstances. And those circumstances will vary throughout India, because it is such a vast and various place. Kerala, for example, has virtually 100% toilet use. Open defecation is not common in Kerala, but the product of that toilet use the excrement doesn't necessarily go into sewage treatment plants. It's often pumped out by honeysuckers and dumped into the nearest water body. But it does at least contain it for households and neighborhoods, transfers it to other places.
I mean, also for example, even in Kerala itself, with relation to caste, when I was accompanying people who deal with food waste, with the amount of food waste that's churned out of the tourist industry, for instance, almost all of them belong to the Dalit caste. I mean, dealing with fish and the oozing juices and so on and so forth. And the women who were dealing with the dry waste, and I think we'll get to the question of calorific value in a second, same in a very similar way. Now in Kerala, because it's a highly regulated place, because it's the most developed state in India considered, a lot of the waste ends up in Tamil Nadu because it's this offshoring into less regulated places. So for example, you spoke of the Coimbatore. Coimbatore takes a lot of the rubbish from Kerala. And other places that I visited when Robin was trying to describe this waste chain. Waste always has to be on the move, but waste also needs a storage place. Kerala doesn't have the space. So you offshore it to places where regulations are lax, where there is storage, where there are people who are willing to handle it, where unions are not as strong, and so on and so forth. The other question of the calorific value?
Yeah, calorific value. Certainly, the fact that most Indian household waste is wet waste, and that has the potential to make power, to make compost. And that potential, where we see, or where we've seen anyway, successful neighborhood projects or local government projects, they always involve composting and sometimes making methane gas to drive power generation out of that wet waste, because it's a wonderful resource. It should go round and round and round. And the labor is there and the knowledge is there to do that in a decentralized way. But it needs space to do it. Even the smallest neighborhood methane plant needs probably a quarter acre. And in a crowded neighborhood, that kind of land is hard to find. And then you've got to appease the neighbors who may not want that going on next door to them.
Hello.
Okay, guys, well, let's have
one more
quick
question,
last
if you
round.
don't mind,
Yeah, please.
Yes, I was born in 1941. I left India at the age of 19. And all I can say is that in those days, we had people who would come and pick up the organic waste and all that, but still, we did not have our homes as clean. Our streets were not as clean. Anything outside our house was not clean. L.K. Advani said that we go around the world talking about India's greatness and how great we are, but he said when I land back in India and I go from the airport to my office or to my home, I see a lot of dirt over there. What I'm trying to say, that recycling is one thing, but to keep India clean, I think is the culture, and we have to hit and we have to just attack the culture. And while we are praising India and Indians for their love and respect and bonding, we should also bring it to their attention that of all the countries that you will see, and I have seen many countries, Indians give the least priority to cleanliness.
Yeah, I think that's a good cautionary issue. Let's get one last point from the lady here, and then we can wrap up.
Hi, I'm Krista. I'm an undergraduate student here. I'm currently doing research on family planning in Maharashtra, and so I was wondering if you could maybe speak to any connections you've researched to population or education, and maybe any potential solutions or beginning of solutions you found.
Oh, you've opened a very big tin of worms there. One immediately wants to talk about first the Nazbandi of the emergency 1975 to 77, which had such, in the long term, an adverse effect on family planning. I think it set family planning back by 2 generations. And the other, of course, is the whole question of childhood stunting in India, which is high by global standards and is often attributed to open defecation and the kind of bacteria that are transmitted from feces left in the open using flies to put them into every child's mouth, particularly in the countryside. and leading to really bad results in childhood nutrition and development. Now that's one for another afternoon, I think. But yeah, I think there are connections, and those are just two of them. But
all right. I think a lot of us would have many more questions, I'm sure, and you'll have some time again to meet the speakers, and so that you can follow up with them directly. But I'd just like to make sure that we can give them both a round of applause. I think,
and a round of applause to you as well, Harsh. You sure you haven't been doing this all your life? Because it's been an excellent session, and of course, it's my humble duty to kindly request Ambassador of India to please address the gathering. Sir.
Thank you very much, Pratik. It's difficult to comment at the end of such an invigorating, trashy discussion. Sorry, I used that word in quotation marks, but thank you very much. That's really been very, very enlightening on a subject which has mercifully become the focus of serious Indian thinking, led by the Prime Minister himself when 4 years ago he started talking about it. And I was fortunate to be sitting on the ramparts of the Red Fort, listening to his first Independence Day speech, when he spoke about toilets. And he said, the world is going to think, what sort of a Prime Minister is this who comes and speaks from the ramparts of the Red Fort, not of large ideas or global strategic visions, etc., but speaks of toilets. And as I know, we've only had the first bite of the elephant so far, but I think the way, how long we have come is, perhaps I realized it on my last flight back to India, on Air India. And I was going through the movies to see how I could pass at least 2 out of the 15 hours. And I settled on a movie which I thought was part of this. It's called Toilet, Ek Prem Katha, Toilet, a love story. And I tell you, it was a very interesting movie. And it attacked the basic issues of sanitation, the mental makeup, the social problems, the economic problems, in a way which, it may not be a solution, it may not be possible, but I think the number of toilets that have actually been built since the Prime Minister started this flagship scheme. As you have noted in the book, he was impacted directly by what he had seen as Chief Minister in Gujarat when the bubonic plague scare came in Surat and also after the earlier floods. And he had seen the kind of disease. So I think it's a huge issue. And I was thinking of sitting there listening to you and thinking of some of the various solutions and things. And a lot of visions, come to mind. I mean, one of the things is if you think of Dickensian London, and you think of the darkness, the cold, the disease, the consumption, where people who, even if they lived till 40, they were considered fortunate, where the Thames was not the beautiful river that you see today, but it was basically a drain, a rather large drain. And there are things, there's a vision of, I've stayed in Geneva, and outside the buildings there would be garbage collection with 3 different colors. So you had to put green, brown, but you had to be careful that the brown, which was I think the glass, you couldn't put it in on a weekend because it disturbs the peace of the neighborhood on a weekend. You could be fined for it. In Singapore, which you're familiar with, people sort of swallow their chewing gum because they can't spit it out. So, there are, I've traveled from Tashkent to Samarkand on a Saturday and found these droves of people walking around picking stuff. And I asked them, I said, what is this happening? And that's the old Russian or Soviet concept of the subotnik, that on a Saturday, people go and give their time to clear up one part of where they are living, or the village, or the road, or something like that. And you talked of this building. 20 years ago, when I first came here, some of us got together and decided to do Shramda, which is, is your donation of labor. And we came here on a few weekends, and we cleared up the basement of this building. And that was before Swachh Bharat was but we actually, there was a lot of junk, and there was a lot of good stuff in the basement. So, separation of junk is indeed important. And I really don't know, I know, but it's difficult to imagine how to solve this, because you talked of the Kabadiwala days. Yes, those were nice days. I've also grown up in India of 60s, and you were right, because absolutely there was less things to throw, because we had less things. You bought one pair of shoes which lasted you until even the cobbler said, now give it up. Otherwise you went on, and you had to. I remember I wanted a second belt, and my parents wouldn't. I didn't dare ask my parents that I should have a second belt. So I took a pair of scissors, and I started cutting it. And the wretched thing wouldn't even cut. So either it was the blunt scissors or the tough leather belt, which wouldn't. So I carried on with the same one, I think, for a few years. So we were used to an economy of scarcity. We were used to carrying on. If you your last year's school uniform became your next year's party clothes, so they were so. You didn't buy a refrigerator every year. You bought one in a life. You bought normally a middle class Indian was fortunate if he could get from 2 wheels to 4 wheels, and he was so happy with those 4 wheels he stuck to them for the next 30 years. He didn't want to change his Fiat or Ambassador for fear of never seeing another one. So there was a culture of repair. There was a culture of protecting, and there was another difference. There was a culture of not wanting to seem as wealthy and extravagant. So even if people had the money, it was discreet money. It was not in your face. Somewhere things have happened, and I don't know whom to blame. We've got plastics, which is the mildest of the problems. We've got worse stuff. I think I've got a great idea for a mystery novel, if I ever write one, is where do mobiles go when they die? I think, so a lot of plenty has come into Indian economy, into Indian society, and today, frankly, I think the garbage, I don't agree that Indians don't put premium on cleanliness. I mean, I think Indians bathe at every possible opportunity if they can find the water. I don't want to compare cultures, but I know in India, I think cleanliness does have a premium. Very often it is a little selfish and personal cleanliness. That my area should be clean. I will have food, I'll throw water around my area so that, things are fine. You can eat whatever, wherever you want to. So somewhere it's a very, given, I'm not quite understood, quite understood the caste argument, but I'll let it pass because I need to understand and read it more before I can argue it. But I think I can argue against it. But I think it's a question of a wide variety of measures necessary. We do need the top-down pressure. Because without the top-down pressure, the consciousness does not happen. We do need the bottoms-up, which happens. We do need the local governments, and they make a huge difference. I know I've gone to Himachal, I live in Himachal sometimes. You can't get a plastic bag in the state. You can say, I'll give you 10 rupees, give me a plastic bag. He says, I can't give you a plastic bag, I don't have a plastic bag. So they wrap your stuff in newspapers, in every shop in Shimla, and you cannot get a plastic bag at all. It's worked. But what happens, and again here the rich-poor thing is interesting. There are people who've come and built huge houses. I know a person who's built a house which is a mansion in the hills, completely out of place, completely. It's a Gatsby sort of mansion in the middle of a forest. He came only once in the 1.5 years since he has built his house. He came to throw a party. And what did he do with all the garbage of the party? He took it to the top of the hill and shoved it into the jungle. So now every time you pass there, you think of that party. Because you can see the remains of it. So I think a lot of the garbage, frankly, is caused by rich people. It's not that, So I think there are no easy definitions and there are no easy solutions. What is encouraging is that today we are on the way. And it's a long way. It's a long way to go. I do wish that in my lifetime I can actually go boating on the Yamuna again, as we used to as children. We used to go boating. You could hire a boat and go across the Yamuna. Today you need a dredger. But maybe things will change and maybe our rivers will be clean again. But I think we have got the political direction. The funding has started to come. It's a question of combination of changing the mindset, providing the infrastructure, providing the technologies. I know the heap in outside Tel Aviv, which is like, it now produces enough gas to light it up at night as a park. So maybe someday, the one outside Delhi will also look the same. But thank you so much for helping us focus on these points and for giving us the opportunity to get a really thinking crowd here, which can raise the question and answers. And thank you so much for moderating it. I know it's a bit of a last-minute thing. And thank you, Sharmila, for having the courage to have commissioned this book or picked this book a little ahead of the time. And that's why we're writing. Thank you.
I think they deserve a big round of applause.
I got another one. There you are.
Here's another. Please join us for a cup of tea, and if you have some more questions for the authors, please feel free to ask. Thank you, everyone, and good night.